The spring of 1942 brought suffocating heat to the mountains of Iran. Along dusty roads, under a relentless sun, marched a column of men who barely looked like soldiers. Their clothes were rags, their faces marked by years of hunger and forced labor in Siberian gulags. They were Poles, freed from Stalin's camps only because Hitler had betrayed his former ally. Now, under British command, they would be reorganized as an army to fight against the Nazis in Europe. They had lost everything. Their homes were left behind when Poland was dismembered between Germans and Soviets in 1939. Entire families disappeared into concentration camps or the frozen depths of Siberia. Many of the men marching that day had watched companions die of cold, hunger, and disease. Their bodies carried deep scars, not only on their skin, but in their souls. They were survivors of a type of war that involved not just bullets, but the systematic destruction of hope. It was amid this group of broken men that something unexpected emerged. A young Iranian, barefoot and wearing simple clothes, approached the camp carrying a cloth sack. Inside it, something moved. The soldiers, tired and suspicious, watched as he opened the sack and revealed a brown bear cub. The creature was small, covered in soft dark fur, with eyes that had not yet lost the innocence of its first months of life. Its mother had been killed by hunters. It was alone. The boy wanted to sell it. The soldiers laughed bitterly. They barely had food for themselves. How could they feed a bear? But there was something about the scene that touched them unexpectedly. Perhaps it was the fact that this cub was also lost, separated from everything it knew, condemned to die if no one helped it. The soldiers recognized something familiar in those frightened eyes. A lieutenant named Anatol Tarnovetsky made an impulsive decision. He gathered what he had of value: some cans of canned meat, a Swiss Army knife, a piece of chocolate melting in the heat, and made the trade. The Iranian boy took the items and disappeared down the road. The soldiers were left with the bear. They named him Wojtek. In Polish, the name meant something like "he who enjoys war" or "happy warrior." It was a name full of irony, considering the cub trembled with fear in the men's arms. But in those first days, Wojtek brought something the soldiers hadn't felt in years: joy. Small, fragile, but real. In the first months, Wojtek was just a mascot. The soldiers fed him condensed milk poured into an empty vodka bottle. He slept among them in the tents, his furry body warming the men during cold mountain nights. He played like a clumsy dog, running between the soldiers' legs, stealing boots and dragging blankets. His presence softened the harshness of daily military life. But Wojtek was growing rapidly. Within weeks, he already weighed over 50 kilograms. His appetite, once satisfied with a few bottles of milk, now demanded absurd quantities of food. He ate fruits, honey, syrup, any sweets the soldiers could scrounge up. And then they discovered something peculiar. Wojtek loved beer. The discovery happened by accident. A soldier left an open bottle near the bear, who licked the liquid curiously. His eyes lit up. He wanted more. The men laughed and gave him another bottle. Wojtek quickly learned that if he stood on his hind legs and asked, waving his front paws, the soldiers would give in. Soon, the 22nd Artillery Supply Company had a beer-addicted bear. But Wojtek wasn't just a funny pet. He observed, learned, imitated the behaviors of the men around him. When he saw soldiers marching in formation, he tried to keep up, his heavy paws beating on the ground in a clumsy rhythm. When greeted by an officer, he raised his paw in something resembling a salute. And most impressively, when he saw men carrying heavy boxes, Wojtek wanted to help. With his natural bear strength, he could lift objects that an adult man could barely move. The soldiers began to realize that Wojtek wasn't just a companion. He was useful, But usefulness, in that context, brought a problem. In 1943, the Polish army received orders. They would be sent to Egypt and then to Italy, where they would fight alongside the Allies against the Axis forces. Preparations began. Equipment was packed, troops organized, documents verified. And then a question arose that no one had anticipated. What to do with Wojtek? British military regulations, which controlled the operation's logistics, were inflexible. Only soldiers could board transport ships. Pets were not allowed. There were no exceptions. The news spread through the camp like a silent blow. The men were shocked. Wojtek had been with them for over a year. He wasn't just a bear, he was part of the family, a symbol of something they had managed to protect amid the chaos of war. Leaving him behind was unthinkable. But how to get around the regulations? The solution came in a form so absurd it seemed like a joke. If only soldiers could board, then Wojtek would be officially enlisted in the army. The Poles began filling out the necessary documents. Wojtek received a serial number, a military pay book, and the rank of private. In official British records, there was now a brown bear listed as an active member of the 22nd Artillery Supply Company. The British officers who inspected the papers must have thought it was an administrative error or some internal Polish joke. But it wasn't. When the ship departed for Egypt, Wojtek boarded like any other soldier, his name appearing on the boarding records. During the voyage, Wojtek behaved like a curious and carefree passenger. He explored the deck, played with the men, and discovered he loved hose baths. Sailors sprayed water on him, and Wojtek rolled on the ground, growling with pleasure. For the Polish soldiers, that scene was a strange reminder of normalcy amid war. But Wojtek's true test was still to come. In 1944, the Polish army was sent to Italy, where they would face one of the war's most brutal battles. Monte Cassino, a strategic German fortress atop a mountain, defended by experienced and well-equipped troops. The battle would be a carnage. Thousands would die trying to take that position. The Poles received the order to support the attack. Their function was to transport artillery ammunition to the front lines, keeping the cannons active while troops advanced under enemy fire. Each ammunition box weighed 45 kilograms. The men carried them on their backs, climbing steep slopes while bullets and shrapnel tore through the air around them. It was in this hell that Wojtek showed who he really was. When the first explosions shook the ground, the men expected the bear to flee in terror. But Wojtek didn't flee. He watched the soldiers running with the ammunition boxes and, as he had done so many times before, wanted to help. He approached, stood on his hind legs, and extended his front paws. A soldier, desperate and out of options, placed a box in Wojtek's arm. The bear held it. Then he took another and another. For hours while the battle raged around them, Wojtek carried ammunition between the supply depots and the artillery positions. He showed no fear. He didn't hesitate. He worked alongside the men as if he had always been one of them. The soldiers were shocked. Some cried with emotion seeing the bear, that creature they had rescued as a helpless cub, now saving human lives. Others laughed hysterically, incredulous at the absurd scene of a bear actively participating in a battle. But everyone agreed on one thing. Wojtek was a hero. When the battle ended and Monte Cassino finally fell into Allied hands, Wojtek became a legend. Stories about the soldier bear spread among Allied troops. Journalists came to interview him. Photographers took pictures of him holding artillery shells, posing alongside soldiers. The image of a bear carrying ammunition became the official symbol of the 22nd Artillery Supply Company, stamped on uniforms and vehicles. Wojtek was promoted to corporal. When the war ended, the Polish soldiers faced a dilemma. Many couldn't return to Poland, now under Soviet control. They were resettled in Scotland, where they tried to rebuild their lives, and they took Wojtek with them. But a 200-kilogram bear couldn't live in military barracks forever. Wojtek was donated to the Edinburgh Zoo, where he spent the rest of his days. Polish veterans visited him regularly, bringing beer and cigarettes, the vices he had acquired during the war. When Wojtek saw his old companions, he stood up, waved his paws, and growled with joy. Until the end, he remembered. Wojtek died in 1963, at 21 years old. Dozens of veterans came to the zoo to say goodbye. Today, statues of Wojtek exist in Poland, Scotland, and elsewhere, eternizing the bear who became a soldier, the animal who proved that courage and loyalty are not exclusive to humans. But Wojtek wasn't the only animal whose name was etched in military history. Decades earlier, during World War I, another unlikely hero emerged from the trenches of France. His name was Cher Ami, and he was a pigeon. The morning of October 3, 1918, dawned cold and foggy in the Argonne forest in northeastern France. Major Charles Whittlesey commanded a battalion of approximately 550 American soldiers, advancing through dense and hostile terrain. Their mission was to push back the German lines, but something went terribly wrong. The units that should have supported them on the flanks couldn't advance. Whittlesey's battalion became isolated, surrounded by German forces on three sides, trapped in a depression in the terrain that would soon be known as the Lost Pocket. During the following days, the men faced a hell of artillery, machine gun fire, and infantry attacks. Ammunition ran out, rations disappeared, drinking water became a distant luxury. The wounded moaned in improvised trenches while the smell of blood and gunpowder permeated the air. Whittlesey knew he needed help, but there was no way to send messages. Phone lines had been cut by bombardments. Messengers sent through the forest were killed or captured before reaching American lines. Only one option remained: carrier pigeons. The Americans had brought boxes of trained pigeons to carry messages in capsules attached to their legs. It was ancient technology, but reliable when everything else failed. Whittlesey had already sent several pigeons, but none returned. Germans shot at any bird they saw flying, knowing pigeons meant enemy communication. When the morning of October 4th arrived, Whittlesey had only one pigeon left in his box, a small male with grey-blue plumage and distinctive markings around his eyes. His registration number was 615, but the soldiers called him Cher Ami, dear friend in French. The situation had become desperate. American artillery, not knowing Whittlesey was isolated, began bombarding the area. Shells fell directly on the trenches where the Americans were sheltering. Men were torn apart by shells from their own cannons. Whittlesey realized that if he couldn't send a message immediately, everyone would die, not at German hands, but from Allied forces. He scribbled a desperate note on a thin piece of paper. "We are along parallel road 276.4. Our own artillery is falling on us. For God's sake, stop." The message was rolled up and placed inside a small aluminum capsule, which was attached to Cher Ami's leg. The pigeon was removed from the box. Soldiers around watched in silence as the bird was released into the air. For an instant, Cher Ami hesitated, his wings beating rapidly as he gained altitude. And then he began to fly. Immediately, the Germans noticed. Machine guns opened fire, rifles fired, the sky filled with projectiles tearing through the air. Cher Ami climbed higher, turning sharply to avoid enemy fire, but he was hit. Soldiers saw feathers explode from his body. The pigeon staggered in the air, losing altitude. For a moment, it seemed he would fall dead among the trees, but Cher Ami didn't fall. With extraordinary effort, he recovered his balance and continued flying. His right leg hung, nearly torn off by a bullet. Blood dripped from his chest, where metal fragments had pierced the skin. One eye was destroyed, blinded by shrapnel. But he continued. For 40 kilometers, through skies full of smoke and fire, Cher Ami flew. His vision was blurred. Pain radiated from his wounded body. Each wing beat required brutal effort. But some primitive instinct, some incomprehensible loyalty to the place he knew as home, kept him airborne. 25 minutes later, Cher Ami landed at his loft at the American base. Soldiers on guard were horrified by the bird's condition. He was bloodied, trembling, barely able to stand. His right leg was practically torn off, hanging by a thin piece of tendon. His chest was covered in blood, but the aluminum capsule was still attached to his wounded leg. With trembling hands, a soldier removed the capsule and read the message. Minutes later, orders were transmitted. American artillery stopped immediately. The bombardment on Whittlesey's battalion ceased. Rescue operations were organized. Reinforcements were sent. Of the 550 men who had been trapped in the pocket, 194 survived. They all owed their lives to a wounded pigeon who refused to give up. Cher Ami was rushed to Army veterinary surgeons. They worked desperately to save him. The destroyed leg had to be amputated. Chest wounds were stitched. The blind eye was removed. For weeks, no one knew if the bird would survive, but Cher Ami was resilient. Slowly, against all odds, he recovered. When the war ended, Cher Ami became a celebrity. Newspapers published his photo in headlines. He was decorated with the French Croix de Guerre, one of the highest military honors. General John Pershing, commander of American forces in Europe, personally praised the pigeon. Cher Ami was sent back to the United States, where he lived his last months as a national hero. He died on June 13, 1919, less than a year after his heroic flight. His body was preserved and today is on display at the Smithsonian National Museum of American History in Washington. Visitors still come from around the world to observe the small grey bird with his wooden prosthetic leg and read the plaque describing how he saved 194 human lives. But Cher Ami's story raises a disturbing question. How did such a small animal, gravely wounded, manage to accomplish something so extraordinary? The answer lies in the unique biology of carrier pigeons. They possess a capability called magnetoreception, allowing them to detect Earth's magnetic field and navigate precisely over long distances. Combined with exceptional visual memory, they can return to their loft even under extreme conditions. During the war, carrier pigeons were trained from chicks to recognize their lofts as home. They were fed, cared for, and conditioned to return whenever released. This instinctive programming was so strong that not even serious injuries could stop them. Cher Ami didn't fly out of conscious courage. He flew because every fiber of his being told him he needed to return home. But does this diminish his heroism? The soldiers he saved certainly didn't think so. For them, it didn't matter whether Cher Ami understood the importance of his mission. What mattered was that he continued when he should have fallen, that he fought against unimaginable pain and completed his flight, that 194 men saw another dawn because a wounded pigeon refused to give up. While pigeons saved lives in European skies, other animals served in equally crucial roles, though less glamorous. In the icy waters of the Black Sea, decades after World War II, the Soviet Union developed a program that seemed straight out of science fiction. Military dolphins. The program began discreetly in 1960, when Soviet scientists realized that bottlenose dolphins possessed unique capabilities that could be militarized. Their echolocation was so precise, they could detect metal objects buried in seafloor mud. Their intelligence allowed complex training, and their speed made them superior to any underwater equipment of the era. In secret facilities along the Crimean coast, dozens of dolphins were captured and subjected to rigorous training programs. The animals learned to identify submarine mines, locate lost torpedoes, and even attack enemy divers. Some were equipped with harnesses containing cameras and tracking devices. Others carried hypodermic needles filled with compressed carbon dioxide, designed to puncture diving suits and cause fatal embolisms. Trainers discovered that dolphins could distinguish between friendly and enemy divers based on specific equipment. They were conditioned to silently approach divers wearing certain types of suits and mark their location, or in more extreme cases, attack directly. The program was so effective that the Americans developed their own version in San Diego, creating an underwater arms race involving marine mammals. For decades, these dolphins operated in contested waters. They protected military ports against saboteurs. They recovered lost equipment at depths humans couldn't reach. And in some cases, according to unconfirmed reports, they participated in lethal operations against enemy divers. The program was so secret that many details remain classified to this day. But there was a fundamental problem with using animals as weapons. They weren't machines. They had personalities, fears, and wills of their own. Some dolphins refused to execute orders. Others developed emotional bonds with specific trainers and wouldn't cooperate with substitutes. And on rare occasions, dolphins simply swam away and never returned, preferring freedom to life in military captivity. When the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, the program was abandoned. Facilities were closed. Many dolphins were sold to commercial oceanariums. Some were released, though experts doubted that animals raised in captivity could survive in the wild. Trainers who had spent decades working with the dolphins reported deep feelings of guilt, knowing they had transformed intelligent and social creatures into instruments of war. Today, dolphins are still used by some navies, including the American, but mainly for non-lethal tasks like mine detection. The idea of transforming animals into underwater assassins has lost favor, not only for ethical reasons, but because drones and underwater robots proved more reliable. Still, the Soviet dolphin program remains one of the strangest and most disturbing chapters in the military use of animals. While dolphins patrol deep waters and pigeons cross war skies, in the muddy trenches of Europe, another animal proved its value in a less spectacular but equally vital way. Dogs. During World War II, more than 50,000 dogs served in American armed forces alone. They were messengers, sentries, mine detectors, and companions to traumatized soldiers. Some breeds, like German Shepherds and Dobermans, were preferred for their intelligence and trainability. But many common dogs, donated by civilian families, also served. One of the most famous was Chips, a mixed German Shepherd donated by a family from New York. Chips was trained as a guard and sentry dog, but proved to be much more. In July 1943, during the Allied invasion of Sicily, Chips's unit was ambushed by an Italian machine gun hidden in a bunker. Soldiers fell under intense fire, unable to advance or retreat without being massacred. Chips, without waiting for orders, broke his leash and ran directly toward the bunker. Witnesses described seeing the dog disappear through the entrance, followed by screams, furious barking, and gunfire. Seconds later, 4 Italian soldiers ran out of the bunker with their hands raised, Chips biting one of their arms. The machine gun fell silent. When American soldiers reached the bunker, they found Chips wounded by grenade shrapnel and gunpowder burns, but alive. He had attacked the machine gun crew alone, forcing their surrender. That night, despite his wounds, Chips still alerted his unit to a second enemy attack, saving lives again. Chips was recommended for the Medal of Honor, the highest American military decoration. but the recommendation was rejected on the grounds that military medals couldn't be awarded to animals. Instead, he received the Silver Star and Purple Heart, which were also later revoked for the same reason. Officially, Chips was never decorated, but for the men whose lives he saved, no medal was necessary. Chips survived the war and returned to his family in New York in 1945. He lived one more year before dying of liver complications, possibly related to war wounds. His family kept his military collar as a sacred relic. But not all war dogs had happy endings. Thousands died in combat. Many were left behind when units evacuated, or were euthanized because they were considered too dangerous to be reintegrated into civilian life. Only when veterans began publicly protesting the treatment of military dogs did policies change, allowing more animals to return home after service. In the frozen plains of the Eastern Front, where temperatures dropped to 40 degrees below zero and winter transformed battlefields into frozen cemeteries, another type of animal played a role that machines simply couldn't: horses. World War II is remembered as the first truly mechanized war, dominated by tanks, planes, and motorized vehicles. But the reality was different. More than 6 million horses were used during the conflict, with the German army depending on horses for 80% of its ground transport. In the Soviet Union, horses carried supplies, pulled artillery, and transported the wounded across terrain where trucks got stuck in mud or froze in ice. These animals faced impossible conditions. In the Russian winter, horses died of hypothermia while pulling cannons through blizzards. Their hooves cracked on ice. Horseshoes froze to their hooves, causing terrible wounds. Food was scarce, and starving horses chewed ropes, wood, anything they could find. When they died, their bodies were often consumed by equally starving soldiers, but some horses became legendary. In the Polish cavalry, which faced German tanks in desperate attacks during the 1939 invasion, riders formed deep bonds with their mounts. Stories circulated about horses that kept running even after being wounded, carrying wounded riders back to safe lines before collapsing. Other horses, trained for artillery, remained motionless under bombardments, while cannons fired from their backs, their bodies trembling with each explosion. One horse in particular, named Warrior, served during World War I under the command of General Jack Seeley. Warrior survived 4 years of combat, including the Battle of the Somme, where millions died. He was buried under rubble, hit by shrapnel, exposed to poison gas, but always survived. When the war ended, Warrior returned to England and lived until 1941, dying at 33 years old, an extraordinary age for a war horse. But Warrior was an exception. Most war horses died of wounds, exhaustion, or were killed when they were no longer useful. Unlike soldiers, horses didn't receive pensions, decorations, or recognition. They were equipment, disposable when broken. Only decades after the war did memorials begin to be erected in honor of the millions of horses that died. One of them, in London, shows a horse carrying military equipment with the inscription, "They had no choice." In the claustrophobic depths of Allied submarines, where men lived in cramped spaces for weeks, breathing recycled air and facing the constant terror of depth charge attacks, another animal played a surprising role: cats. Submarines had a persistent problem: rats. These rodents invaded food compartments, chewed electrical wiring, and spread diseases in already unsanitary environments. Poisons were dangerous in confined spaces, and traps were insufficient. The solution was ancient, but effective: cats. Sailors brought cats aboard as rat hunters, but the animals quickly became much more. In an environment where men spent months submerged, facing constant danger and brutal psychological isolation, cats offered companionship. They slept in bunks with sailors, played with tools, and watched operations with feline curiosity. Their presence brought a sense of normalcy to a profoundly abnormal place. One of the most famous cats was Unsinkable Sam, a tabby cat who first served on the German battleship Bismarck. When the ship was sunk in May 1941, Sam was found floating in wreckage by British sailors. They adopted him and took him to HMS Cossack. 5 months later, the Cossack was also torpedoed. Sam survived again. He was transferred to the aircraft carrier HMS Ark Royal, which was sunk in November 1941. Sam survived a third time. At this point, superstitious sailors decided Sam was unlucky, or perhaps cursed. He was removed from active service and spent the rest of the war on land, living comfortably in a sailor's home until his death in 1955. His story became a symbol of both luck and resilience. But cats on submarines faced unique dangers. When depth charges exploded nearby, the sudden pressure made cats' eardrums bleed. Some became permanently deaf. Others developed strange behaviors due to stress, hiding in torpedo compartments or refusing to eat. Sailors cared for them as best they could, sharing scarce rations and creating improvised beds. When the war ended, many submarine cats were adopted by their crews. Sailors took them home, where they lived the rest of their lives as civilian pets. But some cats were left behind, abandoned when submarines were decommissioned. Their final fate remains unknown. Another forgotten footnote in the history of war. These stories raise a fundamental question. What makes a hero? Is it the conscious understanding of sacrifice, the deliberate choice to face danger, or is it simply doing what needs to be done, regardless of the cost? Wojtek didn't understand the meaning of Monte Cassino. He carried ammunition because it was what he saw his companions doing. Cher Ami didn't fly out of patriotism. He flew because his instinct compelled him to return to the loft. Chips didn't attack the bunker out of calculated courage. He reacted to a threat to the men who cared for him. But does this lack of conscious understanding diminish their acts? The men whose lives were saved certainly didn't think so. For them, intention was irrelevant. What mattered was the result. Wojtek kept cannons firing when men were too exhausted to continue. Cher Ami transmitted a message that saved nearly 200 soldiers. Chips neutralized an enemy position that would have massacred his unit. Perhaps heroism doesn't require understanding. Perhaps it only requires action at the right moment. And in that sense, these animals were heroes, as true as any human soldier. But there's another layer to these stories. They reveal something profound about humanity in war. Men who had been taught to kill, who lived in brutal environments where death was routine, still found room to care for animals. Soldiers who barely had food for themselves shared rations with dogs. Sailors in overcrowded submarines made space for cats. Polish refugees, who had lost everything, risked regulations to save a bear. These acts of compassion weren't strategic. They didn't offer direct military advantage, but they were necessary in a way that weapons never would be. Because war doesn't just destroy bodies. It corrodes the soul, transforms men into killing machines, erases empathy and tenderness. Caring for an animal, feeding it, protecting it, was a form of resistance against that transformation. It was a way to remain human amid dehumanization. Wojtek, Cher Ami, Chips, and countless other animals didn't just serve alongside soldiers. They saved something essential in them. They reminded men hardened by war that kindness was still possible, that loyalty still existed, that amid chaos and death, life still had value. Today, monuments and memorials honor these animals. In London, the Animals in War Memorial shows a horse, a dog, and a mule walking through a wall, with the inscription, they had no choice. In Edinburgh, a statue of Wojtek watches over the city where he spent his final years. At the Smithsonian, visitors can see Cher Ami, preserved forever, his small form a permanent reminder of unlikely courage. But the true tribute isn't in bronze or marble. It's in the stories we continue to tell. In the memories of veterans who, even in old age, speak with tears in their eyes about the dog that saved them or the horse that carried them to safety. It's in the recognition that war isn't just about humans, but about all the lives it consumes and transforms. These animals didn't choose to fight. They didn't understand flags or ideologies. They didn't know why men killed each other. But they were there, alongside those men, sharing danger, hunger, and fear. And when necessary, they acted. They carried ammunition under fire. They flew through bullets. They attacked enemies. They saved lives. If that's not heroism, then the word has no meaning. And perhaps the final lesson of these stories is this: courage doesn't need consciousness. Loyalty doesn't require understanding. And heroism, true heroism, can come from the most unexpected sources. From a bear who loved beer. From a pigeon with a wooden leg. From a dog who didn't know he was at war. They were just animals, but they did things that men would consider impossible. And for that, they deserve to be remembered. Not as mascots or curiosities, but as what they truly were: heroes.